We go to the circus to escape reality, but for those who live in the spotlight, reality begins to escape them. What happens when the makeup becomes a second skin and the laughter starts to sound like a scream? This was my last day as Puddles the Clown. For 10 years, that was me. Not Leo, the quiet man who paid taxes and had a library card, but Puddles. My shtick was the classic sad clown who, through his fumbling and melancholy, made everyone else happy. The irony wasn't lost on me, not at first. The roar of the crowd's laughter was a drug. It filled the hollow spaces. Under the big top, bathed in the hot, buttery lights, I was a god of manufactured joy. But the routine, the relentless, grinding repetition of it all wears you down. The same pratfalls, the same squirting flour, the same sad, painted smile. The grease paint starts to feel less like a mask and more like a second skin. The smell of it, a sweet chemical scent, clung to me, to my clothes, to my trailer. It was the smell of my own identity slowly being painted over. The smile I painted on every night, a wide, white downturned crescent with a single red tear, began to feel more honest than any expression my own face could make. That's when the real show, the one inside my head, began its opening act. It started subtly, a flicker in my peripheral vision. I'd be in the middle of my act, juggling poorly on purpose, and I'd look out at the sea of smiling faces. But one face, just for a second, wouldn't be their own. It would be mine. A child in the front row, laughing hysterically, would suddenly have my painted Puddles smile stretched unnaturally across their small face. The red tear would be there, stark against their cheek. I'd blink, and it would be gone. I told myself it was the lights, the exhaustion. We were doing 3 shows a day, 6 days a week. The mind plays tricks. But then, it happened again. The hot dog vendor, the stern face of our ringmaster, even my own reflection in a puddle of rainwater, they all wore my smile. That sad, painted, permanent grin. It was a virus, and I was patient zero. It was no longer my mask. It was becoming the world's true face, and I was the only one who could see it. The laughter of the audience started to sound different too. It wasn't joyful anymore. It was mocking, thin and metallic, like the laughter of tin dolls. The lines began to blur between the man and the makeup. I started having trouble remembering what my own face looked like without the white base and the black outlines. I'd sit in my small, cramped trailer after the final show, the roar of the crowd still ringing in my ears, and stare into the mirror. I'd try to wipe off the paint, but my reflection would resist. For a terrifying moment, the painted smile would remain on my skin, a stark white stain against my flesh, refusing to yield to the cold cream and tissues. Then I began hearing the music, the calliope. That cheerful, slightly off-key circus melody would start playing at random times, a phantom soundtrack to my life. I'd hear it faintly while trying to sleep, in the quiet hum of the refrigerator, in the rushing water of the shower. It was always there, just on the edge of my hearing, a constant, maddening reminder of the tent, the lights, the act. I was never off stage. The world was now the big top, and I was its sole, unwilling performer, trapped in a never-ending show. My therapist later called it a psychotic break triggered by occupational stress and depersonalization. I called it the day the audience wore my face. It was the Saturday night finale. The tent was packed, the air thick with the smell of popcorn and sweat. I was in the middle of my tightrope gag, pretending to lose my balance. I looked down, ready for the wave of laughter, but there was no laughter. There was only a dead, chilling silence. Every single person in that audience, from the smallest child to the oldest man, was looking up at me, and every single one of them had my face. 1,000 Puddles the clowns, all staring up with the same painted-on tragic smile and the single red tear. Their eyes were dark, empty pits. They weren't watching a show. They were waiting. They were a jury, and I was on trial for a crime I couldn't name. The calliope music swelled in my head, deafening and distorted, a funeral dirge for my sanity. I dropped the balancing pole. It clattered onto the rope, and I scrambled backward, crab-walking away from that sea of my own tormented reflection. I didn't wait for the net. I shimmied down the support pole, ignoring the splinters and the shouts of the crew. I ran. I burst through the backstage curtain, a blur of color and panic. I could hear the ringmaster's confused voice booming over the speakers. I didn't stop. I ran past the cages of sleeping tigers and the trailers of the other performers. I ran until the cheerful lights of the midway were a distant glow, until the phantom calliope music was finally drowned out by the pounding of my own heart. I didn't stop until I found a 24-hour gas station bathroom, its fluorescent lights cold and unforgiving. I looked in the mirror, my chest heaving. The makeup was smeared from sweat and tears, but underneath it, my own skin felt alien. The smile was gone, but I could still feel its shape burned into my muscles. I spent an hour in that bathroom, scrubbing my face raw until it was red and bleeding. I threw the costume in a dumpster behind the station. I just left. I walked away from the circus, from Puddles, from 10 years of my life. I called my boss from a payphone the next day and told him I was done. I couldn't explain it. How do you tell someone you quit because the audience stole your face? How do you explain that the laughter they paid for had eaten you alive from the inside out? They can give it clinical names. They can prescribe me pills to quiet the phantom music, but they can't erase the memory of 1,000 identical tragic smiles looking up at me in silent judgment. That was my last day as a clown because I learned the hard way that when you sell your smile for a living, you eventually forget how to own it. And sometimes it decides to walk away on the faces of strangers.
This was my last day as the Magnifico. My real name is Arthur, but Arthur ceased to exist the moment I put on the sequin tailcoat and the top hat. As the ringmaster, I was the voice of the circus. I was the narrator, the conductor, the bridge between the mundane world of the audience and the fantastical world under the big top. My voice, amplified to a godlike boom, was the thread that wove the entire spectacle together. "Ladies and gentlemen, children of all ages," I would bellow, and with those words, I created reality. I sold the illusion. The problem is, when your entire life revolves around manufacturing a bright, loud, cheerful illusion for 3 hours a night, the quiet, drab reality waiting for you afterwards starts to feel like the actual lie. The contrast is a violent shock to the system, a psychological whiplash. The world outside the tent started to seem gray, muted, and fundamentally unreal. The vibrant, chaotic world of the circus began to feel like the only true thing in existence. The breakdown was a slow leak. The grand, artificial world I commanded every night began to seep into my quiet, lonely life. I started to see things. At first, it was the light. I'd see a phantom spotlight following me as I walked down the aisle of a grocery store. I'd see the shimmer of sequins on a wet patch of pavement. The world was trying to put on a show for me, a pale imitation of my own. Then came the shadows. The circus is a place of extreme light and extreme dark. In the deep, inky blackness, just beyond the reach of the spotlights, your mind can play tricks. I began to see figures in those shadows backstage. They were tall and impossibly thin, their limbs long and jointed like a spider's. They would stand perfectly still in the darkness between the rigging and the animal cages. I called them the Shadow Crew. I knew they weren't real, but they were always there, watching the show from the wings, their featureless forms a silent, unsettling audience that no one else could see. My job was to direct the audience's attention, to be the unwavering center of the storm, but I was losing my own focus. The Shadow Crew started appearing outside the tent. I'd see one standing in a dark alleyway as I walked home, or a silhouette standing in the corner of my trailer, just beyond the reach of my lamp. They never moved, they never made a sound, they just watched. My booming, confident stage voice became a liability. I'd hear echoes of it at odd times, my own cheerful pronouncements bouncing back at me in the dead silence of my trailer. "And now for your amazement!" would echo in my ears as I tried to make a sandwich. My persona was haunting me, a loud sequin ghost that refused to leave when the show was over. I was becoming a spectator to my own unraveling, my mind at three-ring circus of paranoia and hallucination. I was no longer the ringmaster. I was the main attraction in a freak show for one. The final night, the illusion shattered completely. I stood in the center of the ring, the main spotlight a hot white sun pinning me to the floor. I raised the microphone to my lips, ready to unleash my opening salvo. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice echoing through the cavernous space. I looked out at the audience, expecting to see the thousands of eager, smiling faces, but there were no faces. Every single seat, from the front row to the highest bleacher, was filled with them, the Shadow Crew. Thousands of them, sitting perfectly still, their long, dark forms packed together a silent congregation of nightmares. They weren't cheering, they weren't moving. They were all turned toward me, their featureless heads fixed on my position in the center of the ring. The spotlight no longer felt like a sign of importance. It felt like an interrogation lamp. I was the only thing on display, a specimen under their collective silent gaze. The music was playing, the performers were waiting in the wings, but all sound faded away. The world narrowed to me, the spotlight, and the silent, shadowy horde that had come to watch me break. The microphone felt impossibly heavy in my hand. My voice was gone, trapped in my throat. I was supposed to be in control, to be the weaver of the fantasy, but my darkest fantasy had consumed the reality of the show. There was no one to perform for but them, and I had no idea what they wanted to see. I felt a profound, bone-deep terror that went beyond mere fear. It was the horror of absolute solitude, of being the last real person in a world of specters. It was the realization that the illusion I had so carefully crafted and sold every night had finally become self-aware and decided to rewrite the script, with me as the tragic finale. I lowered the microphone. I let it fall from my hand, and the resulting shriek of feedback was the most real sound I had heard all night. It broke the spell. I turned, my sequin coat feeling like a suit of armor made of lead, and I walked out of the ring. I walked past the stunned performers and the frantic stagehands. I walked out of the big top and into the cool night air, leaving a tent full of confused people and an audience of my own personal demons. My psychiatrist calls it derealization disorder. He says my mind, unable to cope with the nightly shift between two extreme realities, simply invented a third one. But I know what I saw. That was my last day as the ringmaster, because I learned that if you stare into the bright artificial lights long enough, you can no longer see what's waiting for you in the darkness. And eventually, the darkness comes to see the show.
This was my last day as a cat tamer. For 8 years, my partners were 500-pound Bengal tigers. My stage name was Seraphina, and I moved with a grace that belied the mortal terror thrumming just beneath my skin. The crowd saw confidence, a woman in sequins who could command the deadliest predators with a gesture and a word. They didn't see the years of conditioning.
The near misses, the constant, gnawing awareness that I was one slipped whip, one moment of doubt away from being torn apart. The job isn't about dominance, it's a lie. It's about convincing a creature that was born to be an apex predator that you are, for 15 minutes a night, something more dangerous than it is. You have to project an aura of absolute control. You live on that razor's edge, and after a while, the edge starts to cut into your mind. You take the fear home with you. It sleeps in your bed and whispers to you in the dark. The first sign that the job was breaking me wasn't a roar, but a whisper. It started in the silence of my trailer, long after the show was over and the generators had been shut down. I would be lying in bed, and I'd hear the low, rumbling chuff of a tiger, the contented sound they make. I'd tell myself it was just a memory, an echo from the day, but it was too real. I could almost feel the vibration of it in the floor. Then, the sounds started to change. I'd hear the scrape of claws on the metal floor of my trailer right outside my door. I'd hear low, guttural growls that seemed to form words, ancient and guttural syllables I couldn't understand but felt in my bones. I was living in a state of hypervigilance, my senses tuned to the phantom presence of the cats. I started to see the world through their eyes. The cheering crowds became a threatening pack. The flashing lights of the midway were the panicked, darting movements of prey. The lines between human and animal, tamer and tamed, began to dissolve. My job required me to study them, to know their every twitch and vocalization. I became so attuned to them that I started to lose my own instincts, replacing them with theirs. I'd find myself pacing in my small trailer, back and forth, a caged energy with nowhere to go. I began to feel phantom sensations, the rough, sandpapery lick of a tongue on my arm, the heavy weight of a paw pressing down on my shoulder as I slept. I'd wake up in cold sweat, my heart hammering, convinced that one of them, my oldest tiger, Raja, was in the room with me, his amber eyes watching me from the shadows. I was becoming feral, my nerves stripped raw. The illusion of control I projected in the ring was a joke. They were the ones in control. Their silent, constant presence was caging me, stalking me through every waking and sleeping moment of my life. My final performance was on a humid summer evening. The tank was suffocatingly hot. From the moment I stepped into the cage, I knew something was wrong. The air was electric with a tension I had never felt before. Roger wasn't watching my whip. He was watching my face, his gaze intelligent and unnervingly calm. The other tigers were restless, pacing the edges of the cage, their tails twitching. I went through the motions, my voice booming with a confidence I didn't feel. I commanded Raja to his pedestal, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. He obeyed, but slowly, with a deliberate grace that felt like mockery. As he settled, he locked his eyes with mine, and then I heard it. Not a growl, not a roar, but a clear, deep voice speaking directly inside my mind. It was a voice that was ancient, powerful, and filled with a chilling patience, and it said, "The show is over, Lil One." My blood turned to ice. My whip fell from my numb fingers. I stared into his eyes, not the eyes of a trained animal, but the eyes of a jailer. The illusion shattered into a million pieces. I wasn't their master. I was their entertainment. I was the one performing tricks for a predator's amusement. In that moment, I understood the profound arrogance of my profession, of humanity itself. We build the cages, but we're the ones truly trapped by our own fear and need for control. The other tigers stopped pacing. They all turned to look at me, their movements synchronized, their expressions identical to Raja's. They were waiting. The crowd, sensing the shift, grew quiet. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own harsh, shallow breathing. The voice in my head spoke again, softer this time, almost a purr. "You may leave the cage. We are done with you." I didn't run.
I simply turned my back on them, a suicidal act for any tamer, and walked to the gate. One of the stagehands, his face white with fear, fumbled with the latch and swung it open. I walked out of the cage, down the short steps, and kept walking. I walked through the backstage area, past the bewildered faces of the other performers, and out into the night. I didn't look back. I could feel their eyes on me, a physical weight on my shoulders, until I was clear of the circus grounds. I didn't stop walking until I reached the highway. The sequins in my costume glittered in the headlights of passing cars. I was no longer Serafina, the fearless tamer. I was just a woman who had stared into the abyss and heard it speak. I was diagnosed with a complex form of PTSD. The doctors said I developed auditory hallucinations from years of stress. But I know what I heard. That was my last day as a tamer, because I learned that when you spend your life staring into the eyes of a monster, you're lucky if all it does is talk back.